Why would a skeptic want to read philosophy? You read philosophy and you're a skeptic? You're clearly not that bright. So this is a problem I commonly run into. It's a frequent problem that I probably deal with at least a couple of times a week, where somebody will hear that I am a skeptic and then proceed to say that I shouldn't study philosophy, or that I just don't understand philosophy, or that I shouldn't be reading books in general.
You're not very bright, are you?
Very rarely will you get someone who is a bit curious and goes, oh, okay, then why do you read philosophy? Right? Most people would just say that I shouldn't be reading philosophy, or that I shouldn't be studying, or I shouldn't be doing any of these things because I'm a skeptic. So in this video, I want to explain why I'm a skeptic and why I continue to read philosophy despite the fact that I am a skeptic.
What kind of idiots do you have working here?
So what is skepticism? There are some people who use skepticism to mean like just the process of doubting, okay? Like they just mean you're doubtful of things, okay? You're a skeptic. But in the context of how I'm using the word, and I'd say in the context of reading philosophy, skeptic means someone who believes that knowledge is not certain, or that it is impossible to have certain knowledge, or true justified belief, epistemically justified belief. That's how I'm using it. That's what the word means in this context. And there are varieties of skepticism. There are people who are religious skeptics. They doubt the nature of God. They think that having a knowledge of God is impossible. There are moral skeptics who believe that having moral knowledge or objective morals is impossible. There are epistemic skeptics who believe that all of our methods of belief are unjustified. There are tons and tons of varieties of skeptics. But the kind of skeptic that I am wouldn't fit into one of these specific notions of skepticism, like moral skepticism or religious skepticism. My kind of skepticism comes from the trilemma. And my kind of skepticism, as I'm sure some of you have already tried to preempt this, doesn't make the claim that all knowledge is impossible, because some people take this claim to be like contradictory. That if you say all knowledge is impossible, well, is that a possible thing? Some people say it's just a belief, it's an assumption that knowledge is impossible, and you have to persuade them out of it. And other people think that all knowledge is impossible, except for the belief that all knowledge is impossible. We don't have to worry about that, because that's not the kind of skeptic I am necessarily. The kind of skeptic I am comes from the Munchausen's trilemma. What the Munchausen's trilemma is a very famous thought experiment that explains basically whenever you assert a standard of evidence, you can apply that standard of evidence to itself. And when you do that, you will find that you can't use the standard of evidence to justify itself. So if, for example, you say that seeing something determines whether it is true or not, you can then ask, well, can you see yourself seeing something? Because if your method of determining whether something is true or not is seeing, then in order to determine whether seeing itself is justified or not, you need to be able to see yourself seeing yourself, right? That's a bit convoluted. But that's the idea. So for example, there's a famous one called falsification. Everyone in philosophy of science says, your theory has to have falsification. It's quite popular. But falsificationism cannot itself be falsified. Okay, so the idea that a theory is only a scientific theory, whether it has falsification or not depends on whether you can falsify it. Well, then the idea of falsification itself wouldn't be scientific, and so you would have a problem there. The same thing holds true for virtually all beliefs. When you ask for a standard of evidence, you can basically ask, well, does it justify itself? And in most cases, it's no. And then you might say, well, okay, then we could do something fancy like circular reasoning, okay? A lot of people try to do like circular reasoning. They'll say, well, maybe I don't need to see myself seeing something. Maybe I can have an eye doctor tell me into my ear that my eyes are good. Okay, then you say hearing justifies seeing. Now, from there you can go into like, I don't know, touching justifies hearing, or you could go to seeing justifies hearing, but that would be kind of begging the question or circular reasoning, which doesn't really get you anywhere. And so because there is no solution to this trilemma, at least that I can tell, right? As far as I can tell, no one has a solution to this trilemma without using a argumentation fallacy. I don't believe that there is anything that is truly epistemically justified. I have not come across anything that is epistemically certain. Which would mean every one of these books on my shelf, according to that conclusion, would be equally arbitrary. that all of them would be uncertain. They have no truths hidden inside them to be presented to you. I'm not going out and discovering truths about the world, so on and so forth. And in that case, then the next question that usually comes up is, what is the point of even reading? Which is what I'm not going to answer. There's a couple of points actually. The first one is something being arbitrary in and of itself doesn't make it not fun. Okay, so I can still enjoy reading books and still enjoy going through the learning process, even if I don't believe that it's epistemically justified. Something can be completely uncertain and I can still have fun doing it. Another reason is usefulness. I find going into a domain where I have no expertise and reading a bunch of technical models to help me map my perceptions can actually be quite useful. As example, nutrition sciences. I never studied nutrition sciences formally. When I started reading books on nutrition science, I got a bunch of new models about nutrition science, and I was able to use that to bring about new outcomes in my life, right? I could feel healthier and so on and so forth. I still find them useful even though they are not certain, right? These nutrition science models aren't the truth, or like whatever that means, or epistemically justified. They're not certain, but they can still be useful. As far as I'm concerned, the idea that something is arbitrary makes it useless. I don't think that follows. I think things can be very arbitrary and still be useful. So that's another reason why I read. I think there's a lot of utility to be gained from reading, even if the models are arbitrary. Another reason is that some issues I find will have consequences no matter what you do, and so it's best to actually be informed on the issues. I think a great example of this might be like a presidential election. So let's say you have Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. It's probably going to be good to seek out materials that persuade you one way or the other, even though they're both equally arbitrary, to decide whether you should go Joe Biden or Donald Trump, okay? Because the consequences of who gets elected will probably impact you. We can't be certain, but we could probably assume that that's a reasonable assumption. And that's another reason to read, right? Some things you just need to read about, like for example, taxes. Which countries have better tax policies for investments? It's not certain, but if you had to make a useful assumption, I would say you should probably assume taxes are going to impact you.
No! No! No!
And even if you thought about this more intuitively, if you weren't a skeptic and you were like a realist of some sort, okay? Would you never read a book that you thought was wrong? That sounds like a good way to engage in an echo chamber, right? If I was a complete and total neoliberal, or just a liberal in the classical sense, like a Adam Smith stylish liberalism, would I never read Karl Marx? No, right? I mean, I would probably still read Karl Marx. I'd want to hear what he has to say, and some of his models might be interesting just to explore. Maybe they don't accurately characterize the current society, but they could be accurate characterizations of a possible society, right? I still think there's utility in reading something that you think is just wrong. And so by that reasoning, even though you think something is wrong, you could say the same thing about if you think something is arbitrary, you could still read it because there might be utility to be gained from it. Now, there are some pieces of literature that I do not read as a result of becoming a skeptic. I'd say the first one has to do with metaphysics in general. Because metaphysics in general, I find it's just a framing game. A lot of the time, it's just like, if you think about just everything you're perceiving right now fundamentally, no frames, no solipsism or realism, you could very readily apply either solipsism or realism to it, right? And some people think some arguments persuade you to being a realist, or some arguments persuade you to being a solipsist, or like an internal realist, whatever you want to word it. But ultimately, it's the same stuff, right? So if I call, like, if as a great example is, if I look at like an apple, and I say it's an apple, we can agree to that. If I say it's a chair, we can agree to that. We can basically play this framing game for labels. But when the labels have different entailments, some people tend to think the framing game stops. So like, if I say the stuff I'm perceiving is produced by my mind versus the stuff I'm perceiving is produced by reality, it doesn't change this fact that there's stuff that I'm seeing. If I say that you exist as like an NPC inside my mind and you're not conscious, versus I say you exist in the external world and you're a real person, you are conscious. In terms of ontology, nothing changes. Everything behaves the same. Now, some people will say that, well, okay, but if you think other people are NPCs, then that changes how you morally treat them. In which case, I would say, not necessarily. If you're a skeptic, then you realize there aren't any necessary entailments baked into any worldview, as far as I can tell. Okay, as far as I can tell, there is nothing in solipsism that says you have to treat people poorly, right? And so if you have the preference to be moral, then whether someone's an NPC or not doesn't matter, because moral behaviors are your preference. This idea that solipsism comes with like this complete and total chaotic moral compass and like you have to do evil things is not true. And even then, it doesn't change. Again, it doesn't change the ontology. So even if you believe someone was an NPC and you didn't have to treat them moral, and you're a solipsist, okay, it doesn't change the fact that if you go and punch somebody, they'll punch you back. The ontology behaves the same, which brings the point back to it's just a framing game. I find metaphysics in general is just a game where you frame things, and it is interesting in the beginning, but the more you read it, the more repetitious it becomes. Which brings me to the next point. A lot of metaphysics writings are basically redoing the same old arguments that have been going on for the last couple hundred years. So some people will say like the problem of other minds is solved by the argument from analogy. Some people say that the idea of realism is debunked by the argument from hallucination. There's so many repetitious arguments that come up in maybe a slight different form. It gets boring once you realize they're all equally arbitrary, and it's kind of like the reason why it gets boring is there's a combinatorial approach kind of baked into the way humans make arguments around these arguments, and once you read enough books, you've kind of gone through like an exhaustive amount of possible combinations with these arguments, and yeah, you find it's like really repetitious and it gets boring. There are some exceptions, however, when it comes to niche areas. So I will read metaphysics when it's in niche areas because these tend to be very unique and they tend to be not like dogmatic claims, but very idiosyncratic claims. For example, the metaphysics of death. There's a lot of interesting ideas in the metaphysics of death. I've seen some people talk about the metaphysics of death itself. I've seen some people talk about the metaphysics of death as it relates to society. I've seen a lot of different interesting takes on the metaphysics of death. There's also things like the metaphysics of curiosity. I think that's a very interesting area to explore. And it's not commonly done, so it's still kind of got some novelty to it. And so I'll read stuff like that. But in general, I would say like metaphysics is probably the one area where I just won't read anymore because it's a bit repetitive. And you could say like this carries on to like sub areas in philosophy too, like the philosophy of perception, philosophy of ethics. I do find gets a bit repetitive and boring once you go through like the first, second, third year like university stuff. That stuff gets really boring. So in general then, the reasons why I read books, even though I am a skeptic, which might surprise some people, is it's fun, it's useful, and there's, again, like practicality to doing it, right? Some things will influence you, whether you like it or not, and so you should be as informed as you reasonably can be on the issue. With that being said, if you have any questions, let me know and I'll answer them in the comment section. Bye-bye.